Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Return of the Jedi is widely characterized as a simple moral fable concerning the triumph of good over evil, a concluding chapter defined by its shift toward a lighter, more populist tone. This consensus suggests the film serves primarily as a triumphant spectacle of rebellion, where the defeat of a monolithic empire offers a clean, satisfying closure to a long-standing ideological conflict. However, this reading is incomplete. Rather than functioning as a mere victory march, Return of the Jedi acts as a profound meditation on the mechanics of institutional collapse and the psychological exhaustion required to dismantle a legacy of tyranny. The film's true weight lies not in the destruction of the Death Star, but in the intimate, harrowing pivot from political revolution to the reclamation of individual humanity. The world of the film is defined by an atmosphere of stagnant, industrialized decay. The Galactic Empire is depicted as an architecture of sterile, cold efficiency, where the vastness of the setting serves to dwarf the individual. This is a universe governed by a hypermonopoly on resources and life itself. The Death Star too represents the ultimate commodification of power, a vacuum of light and life that seeks to consolidate total control through the erasure of dissent. Beneath this, the shadows, represented by Jabba's palace, reveal a society defined by depravity, where the black market dictates the terms of existence for those pushed to the periphery. The visual geography reinforces a rigid hierarchy. The high-ranking officers inhabit the antiseptic, monochromatic corridors of the station, while the galaxy's outcasts scrounge for survival in the grime of Tatooine. This environment is not merely a setting, but a suffocating apparatus that demands total subservience. At the center of this structural rot is the internal trajectory of Luke Skywalker. His development is marked by an epistemic fracture. He realizes that the mythos of his father, the narrative of the hero, was a foundation of broken glass. The film demands that he reconcile his identity not as a warrior, but as a person capable of resisting the binary programming of his upbringing. Luke's journey is defined by a deep, somatic trauma. His mechanical hand, a persistent physical reminder of his vulnerability, functions as a site of cognitive dissonance throughout the narrative. He is constantly confronted by the temptation of power, which manifests as the Emperor's siren call. The Emperor stands as the ultimate logical extreme of the system, a pragmatist who views all life as expendable assets in a grand, ego-driven design. His presence is a mirror to the galaxy's inherent coldness, testing whether Luke will succumb to the same parasitic cycle of violence. The film's philosophical backbone resides in the rejection of absolute power. Luke refuses to adopt the language and tactics of the Emperor, ultimately choosing a path of non-resistance. This choice is an act of defiance against the very cycle of destruction the rebellion seeks to escape. By throwing away his weapon, Luke rejects the utilitarian calculus that justifies murder for a greater good. Instead, he reclaims his agency through the affirmation of empathy. This is an articulation of ethical resistance that places the burden of peace entirely on the individual. The film posits that the only true victory over an authoritarian system is to deny that system its most precious commodity, the corruption of the human soul. Technically, the film utilizes light and shadow to externalize this moral struggle. The stark contrast of the throne room, the blinding white lights of the Death Star's heart against the deep, cavernous shadows, serves to isolate Luke in his moment of greatest decision. The cinematography frequently employs tight, claustrophobic framing during these intimate confrontations, forcing the audience to bear witness to the raw, unadorned emotional labor required to choose mercy over retribution. When the Emperor finally falls, the lack of musical score and the deliberate, weighted pacing of the scene underline the gravity of the transformation. It is a moment of existential resolution rather than military conquest. Return of the Jedi functions as a complex tapestry of human resilience. It refuses to equate the destruction of a regime with the salvation of the spirit, acknowledging instead that the harder struggle occurs within the self. The film's enduring legacy is its commitment to the idea that peace is not an objective state achieved through superior force, but a subjective, radical choice made in the face of inevitable, crushing pressure. By the final scene, the celebration on Endor is not just a triumph of a cause, but a collective exhale of survivors. The film concludes with the realization that the most significant rebellion is the one that takes place in the quiet, empty spaces of the mind, where an individual finally asserts their humanity against the machine. The subversion question. Return of the Jedi is frequently categorized as a triumphant, fable-like conclusion to the heroic journey of Luke Skywalker. The surface-level consensus views the film as a simplistic victory of good over evil, where the destruction of the Death Star and the redemption of Darth Vader serve as the ultimate validation of traditional morality. However, this reading is incomplete. Return of the Jedi is, in truth, an unsettling meditation on the failure of institutional systems and the necessary, terrifying isolation of the individual who chooses to walk away from both the state and the rebellion. The film functions not as a celebration of the status quo restored, but as an indictment of the cycle of violence that demands young bodies to build, maintain, and ultimately destroy the structures of power. The architectural hierarchy of the film, from the claustrophobic, slime-choked recesses of Jabba's palace to the sterile, unreachable heights of the Death Star's throne room, reveals a world defined by absolute containment. While the rebellion is presented as the moral antithesis to the Empire, the film's visual language subtly aligns them through their mutual reliance on massive, dehumanizing hardware. Whether it is the frantic labor of the Ewok scavenging Imperial technology or the cold, precise machinery of the Emperor's station, the film depicts a reality where power is synonymous with technological dominance. The normal experience for the denizens of this galaxy is one of resource scarcity and constant surveillance. In this context, the rebels are not merely freedom fighters but a competing faction vying for control of the same mechanisms of galactic order that the Empire perfected. The character arc of Luke Skywalker serves as the film's core epistemic fracture. Luke begins the narrative as a weapon of the Jedi Order, a dogmatic system that demands his total detachment from his own humanity. His journey is not a transition from boy to man, but a transition from tool to individual. His refusal to strike down his father in the final act is often misread as a victory of good, but it is actually a rejection of the binary logic imposed by both the Emperor and Yoda. By throwing away his weapon, Luke rejects the utilitarian calculus of the war itself. He realizes that to participate in the destruction of the Empire by traditional means is to validate the very system of violent retribution that created the conflict in the first place. His survival is not a product of strength, but of a radical, existential surrender. The Emperor serves as the manifestation of the film's most cynical truth: power is not held by force alone, but by the orchestration of the opponent's own ideology. He understands that for the rebellion to succeed in his image, they must mirror his tactical brutality. The structural tell of the film, its pacing, which consistently shifts from the tactical, fleet-based maneuvers of the war to the quiet, agonizingly intimate confrontations in the throne room, privileges the individual choice over the collective effort. While the Alliance celebrates the tactical victory of the space battle, the film lingers on the psychological collapse of the Sith hierarchy, suggesting that the true liberation of the galaxy is an internal event that occurs long before the last ship explodes. The film's refusal to provide a clean, structural resolution is evident in its final imagery. The revelry on Endor is a fragile, temporary state, built upon the ruins of a battlefield that remains littered with the debris of a war that has essentially ended in a stalemate of exhaustion. The consensus reading of the film as a happy ending ignores the heavy cost of this comfort. It allows the audience to ignore the fact that the political structures of the galaxy are inherently volatile and that the next generation of power seekers is already waiting in the wings. By choosing to frame the end of the film as a private, ghostly encounter rather than a public, political triumph, the directors force the viewer to confront the isolation of the survivor. Luke is left alone, separated from his allies by a chasm of experience and trauma that they cannot comprehend, rendering the victory empty of communal meaning. Ultimately, Return of the Jedi is a profound critique of the cycle of heroism. It argues that true agency is found only in the refusal to be a cog in any narrative, be it the Empire's order or the rebellion's revolution. The film's most powerful moments are not the displays of technological might or the spectacle of space warfare, but the quiet, agonizing scenes where characters realize their own roles are pre-programmed by the institutions they serve. The film leaves the audience not with a sense of restored order, but with the haunting realization that the struggle for freedom is a perpetual, isolating process that cannot be finalized by the destruction of a single machine. The Jedi of the title is not a title of status or success, but a mark of someone who has finally stepped outside the system entirely, choosing the burden of an uncertain, individual freedom over the violent, predetermined destiny of a savior. The anomaly question. Return of the Jedi is widely perceived as a celebratory conclusion, a triumphant fairy tale where the heroes defeat an evil empire and restore peace to the galaxy. However, this consensus ignores the film's fundamental status as a brutal study in the transition from ideological warfare to the precarious management of institutional power. The central anomaly of the film, the inclusion of the Ewoks, a primitive species capable of dismantling the most advanced technological force in the galaxy, is not a tonal lapse or a marketing concession. It is the visual thesis of the film. Return of the Jedi argues that power structures built on total control and technological superiority are inherently brittle, inevitably collapsing when confronted by a chaotic, decentralized force that operates outside the rules of the system they intend to dominate. The film's synthesis lies in the realization that the victory of the Rebel Alliance is not a military triumph of better technology, but the victory of an organic, unpredictable reality over a frozen, mechanical obsession with order. The world of the Galactic Empire is defined by a suffocating commitment to architectural and social hierarchy. Every setting, from the sterile, cold geometry of the second Death Star to the stark, minimalist throne room of the Emperor, reflects a worldview where value is strictly synonymous with power and precision. The Empire operates as a closed system where information is controlled, dissent is neutralized, and the geography of power is strictly vertical. High-ranking officers and the Emperor occupy elevated positions of physical and moral remove, looking down upon a galaxy they treat as a resource to be managed rather than a life to be fostered. This economic reality is one of total extraction. The Death Star is the ultimate symbol of a capital-intensive project that consumes entire planetary resources to project a monopoly on violence. Within this environment, Luke Skywalker's psychological journey mirrors the collapse of the Empire's rigid structures. His transition from a traditional warrior monk, the archetype of the Jedi Knight, to a figure who refuses to strike his father in the final confrontation represents a total rejection of the means-end logic that defines the Emperor's worldview. Luke's refusal to kill is an act of epistemic rebellion. He recognizes that by engaging in the binary violence the Emperor demands, he would simply perpetuate the existing system. The film's most intense emotional tension resides in this pivot. Luke moves from a linear, destiny-driven understanding of himself as a weapon of the light to a nuanced, autonomous individual who takes responsibility for the life of his enemy. The Ewoks, situated in the organic, cluttered forests of Endor, serve as the formal rupture that dismantles the Empire's hubris. They represent the anomaly that the Imperial logic cannot calculate. While the Empire operates through mass-produced hardware, the Ewoks utilize the environment itself as a weapon, relying on indigenous, low-tech ingenuity. This is not merely a tactical victory, it is a philosophical one. The Empire treats the galaxy as a machine to be tuned, but they fail to account for the erratic, irrepressible vitality of the natural world. The Ewoks are the embodiment of an existence that refuses to be quantified or colonized. When their traps and primitive projectiles overwhelm the stormtroopers, the film visually asserts that the rigid, sterile machines of the Empire possess no answer to a force that does not play by the rules of conventional, technological warfare. The film's craft reinforces this shift from the mechanical to the organic. The cinematography in the Emperor's throne room uses stark, artificial light and negative space to isolate the characters, emphasizing their entrapment within a doomed ideology. Conversely, the sequences on Endor employ deeper, more chaotic color palettes and natural lighting, suggesting a world that is messy, vibrant, and alive. This aesthetic choice mirrors the narrative outcome. The sleek, polished silver of the Death Star is destined to be shattered by the stubborn, enduring presence of the forest. The technical execution of the battle scenes further emphasizes the displacement of the Empire. As the Imperial forces falter, the camera moves with the frantic, unpredictable rhythm of the Ewoks, capturing the collapse of an organized force against a disorganized, authentic threat. The synthesis of these elements reveals that Return of the Jedi is an inquiry into the failure of absolute control. The final scenes do not suggest that the galaxy has reached a perfect, static state, but rather that the systems of control have been broken, leaving space for something new to emerge. The film's legacy is found in its insistence that the most effective challenge to an oppressive, hyper-technological power is not an equal and opposite force, but a return to the chaotic, unmanageable reality of life itself. The victory is not found in the destruction of the Death Star, but in the moment the protagonist recognizes that the cycle of violence is a choice, not an inevitability. By rejecting the Emperor's demand for a successor, Luke ensures that the systemic collapse of the Empire is absolute. The film leaves the viewer not with the assurance of a permanent peace, but with the hope that, when the structures of oppression fall, the decentralized and the overlooked possess the resilience to start again. The synthesis question. Return of the Jedi is often misremembered as a simplified conclusion to a galactic fairy tale, a victory lap defined by the defeat of a monolithic evil. This consensus, however, ignores the film's foundational anxiety regarding the nature of authority and the volatility of the self. The film is actually a complex treatise on the necessity of radical empathy as the only viable mechanism to dismantle generational cycles of trauma. The anomaly of Luke Skywalker discarding his lightsaber before the Emperor serves as the physical proof of this thesis. By refusing the binary of warrior versus warrior, he shifts the conflict from a physical clash of power to a psychological refusal of the system's logic. The social hierarchy of the Empire is predicated on the commodification of life and the rigid enforcement of fear-based order. The Emperor sits at the apex of this architectural reality, utilizing the Death Star II not merely as a weapon, but as a visual manifestation of total systemic dominance, where human life is rendered inconsequential against the scale of industrial destruction. This environment forces a binary existence upon its citizens, demanding absolute adherence to the state or total exile in the fringes, represented by the squalor of Tatooine or the disparate, communal resistance of the Rebel Alliance. Psychologically, the film operates on the premise that trauma is not a destination but a cycle. Luke's journey represents the struggle to move beyond the fabricated ego constructed by his mentors, Obi-Wan and Yoda, who insist that his father is a personification of evil that must be eradicated. The epistemic fracture occurs when Luke realizes that his teachers, much like the Emperor, view the world through a lens of pragmatic necessity that demands the destruction of the other. He recognizes that the Jedi's mandate, to eliminate the Sith, merely perpetuates the same cycle of retributive violence that birthed Vader. His trauma is stored in his cybernetic hand, a literal physical reminder of his lineage, forcing him to confront the reality that he is not a pure knight, but an inheritor of the very shadow he seeks to conquer. Philosophically, the film rejects the utilitarian calculus offered by the Emperor, who views the sacrifice of the rebellion as a necessary cost for stability. Instead, Luke embraces a radical form of non-action. By throwing his weapon away, he rejects the Kantian imperative of duty to the cause and instead acts upon a personal, moral conviction that ignores the consequences of the immediate survival. This is an absurd revolt. He rejects the inevitability of the path set for him by the state, by the prophecy, and by his own mentors. He chooses to risk total annihilation rather than participate in the transactional nature of power. The technical execution reinforces this shift toward interiority. The cinematography transitions from the cold, high-contrast geometry of the Death Star to the soft, organic diffusion of the forest moon of Endor. The visual language of the throne room scene is particularly crucial. The Emperor is framed within the stark, dark silhouette of the station's architecture, while Luke is frequently placed in positions of vulnerability, surrounded by empty space that emphasizes his rejection of the power structures pressing down upon him. The sound design plays a critical role here as well. The heavy, rhythmic mechanical breathing of Vader becomes a diegetic anchor, a sonic representation of the machine that is being slowly stripped away. When the mask is finally removed, the shift from synthetic, metallic noise to the fragile, labored breathing of an aging man demystifies the antagonist, reducing the Empire's primary weapon to a dying individual. The synthesis of these elements makes clear that the film's true resolution is not the explosion of a space station, but the internal quiet of a son looking at his father. The legacy of Return of the Jedi lies in this refusal to celebrate the hero as a destroyer. The final scene, which mirrors the film's beginning in its focus on the individual, suggests that the state can only be dismantled once the individual realizes they are not a cog in its machinery. The film argues that the ultimate act of defiance against a system built on dominance is the cultivation of a humanity that the system cannot categorize. By choosing to prioritize the soul over the institution, Luke does not just win a war, he breaks the cycle, proving that the most profound systemic change begins with an individual's refusal to be defined by the weapons they are handed. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. Return of the Jedi serves as a profound meditation on the collapse of totalitarian systems through the lens of institutional scarcity and the reclamation of individual agency. While often viewed as a simple triumph of good over evil, the film operates as a sophisticated examination of how the Galactic Empire maintains its hegemony through the absolute monopolization of power, technology, and the commodification of life itself. The Imperial reality is defined by a rigid economy of scale where the Death Star acts as the ultimate visual and physical manifestation of state-controlled resource extraction. By concentrating the galaxy's wealth, labor, and hyperdense materials into a singular, planet-killing instrument, the Empire creates a world where existence is entirely contingent upon participation in its industrial apparatus. The baseline normal for this galaxy is one of pervasive industrial decay. Civilian life is characterized by the scavenging of obsolete hardware and the struggle for survival on the fringes of Imperial influence. In places like Tatooine, the scarcity of resources drives the illicit economy. Jabba the Hutt's palace serves as a microcosm of the Empire's own parasitic nature, where sentient beings are treated as disposable commodities, servants, entertainers, or trophy assets in a frozen carbonite tomb. This commodification of the body reflects a society where labor and consciousness have been stripped of intrinsic value, subordinated instead to the whims of those who command the highest-tier technology. The Empire's power is not merely military, it is a profound technological gatekeeping that ensures the means of production and destruction remain firmly in the hands of the elite, leaving the rest of the populace to navigate the rusted-out remnants of a galaxy they no longer own. The film meticulously contrasts the sterile, uniform architecture of the Empire with the chaotic, organic vitality of the Rebel Alliance. The Imperial corridors are cavernous, light-starved, and oppressive, reflecting a philosophy of absolute order where the individual is rendered insignificant. In contrast, the Rebel infrastructure is modular and reclaimed, relying on a distributed network of labor and shared intellectual resources. When the protagonists penetrate the heart of the Death Star, they are moving through an environment that treats space as a cold, administrative resource, whereas their own strategy relies on an epistemology of decentralized communication and local knowledge. The Empire's downfall is rooted in this structural rigidity. It is a system so committed to the preservation of its centralizing hierarchy that it becomes blind to the significance of the peripheral actors it deems inconsequential. Central to this struggle is the psychological evolution of Luke Skywalker, whose journey represents the internal rejection of the Imperial metanarrative. He begins the film confronting the trauma of his lineage, struggling with the burden of a destiny carved out by the very powers he intends to dismantle. The epistemic fracture occurs when Luke realizes that the binary logic of his mentors, who demand the destruction of his father as the only path to victory, is a continuation of the same cycle of violence that created the Empire. His refusal to act as a weapon for the Jedi institution, much like his refusal to serve as a puppet for the Sith, constitutes an act of radical autonomy. He recognizes that by choosing to spare his father, he is not merely saving a life but breaking the feedback loop of control that sustains the galactic power structure. The resolution of Return of the Jedi is an assertion that systemic collapse is not merely an external event driven by military victory, but a necessary consequence of individual defiance against a deterministic universe. When the Emperor falls, it is the result of a singular, unpredictable choice that the Empire's sophisticated predictive algorithms could not account for. The film argues that the true currency of the galaxy is not raw material or technological dominance, but the preservation of the capacity to choose against the weight of a system designed to dictate every outcome. By the final scene, the destruction of the Death Star acts as a physical purging of the hyper-mediated control the Empire enforced, allowing for the restoration of a world where existence is no longer a metric of state-approved utility. The triumph is not merely that a government has fallen, but that the characters have reclaimed the right to exist outside the architecture of power, finding a lasting synthesis in the quiet, fragile autonomy of the liberated. Architecture and the visual geography. Return of the Jedi concludes the original trilogy by codifying a visual geography that maps moral clarity onto physical space. The film establishes a rigid architectural hierarchy that mirrors the galactic political structure, where power is defined by the containment of the organic within the synthetic. The Empire exists as a monument to controlled, sterile geometry, epitomized by the Death Star II. This station is a masterpiece of fascist aesthetics, characterized by endless, frictionless corridors, monochromatic palettes, and harsh, uniform lighting. These spaces serve as a physical extension of the imperial ideology, which demands the elimination of erratic variables. Navigation within these zones is rhythmic and predictable. The camera glides through the Death Star's shafts with a cold, mechanical precision that denies the viewer any sense of human warmth or chaotic spontaneity. The individual is rendered insignificant by the crushing scale of these vast, industrial interiors, which operate as literal conduits for the Empire's singular, terrifying will. In direct opposition to this sterile uniformity, the film positions the organic world as the site of resistance and chaotic life. The environments of Tatooine and Endor prioritize texture, decay, and the unevenness of the natural world. Jabba's palace on Tatooine is a subterranean, cluttered cavern filled with a grotesque, layered variety of species. Unlike the sleek efficiency of the Empire, the palace is a masterwork of grime and atmospheric density, where the shadows are thick and the architecture feels carved out rather than constructed. This visual language reinforces that, while the Empire occupies the high, clean ground of absolute control, the rest of the galaxy lives within the lived-in, salvaged remnants of an older reality. The infrastructure of the rebellion and the periphery of the galaxy is defined by its state of disrepair, suggesting a society that has moved past the sleek, utopian promises of a golden age and into a pragmatic reliance on whatever tools are available. The moon of Endor offers the most significant visual contrast, as the film embeds its climatic battle within a dense, living forest. The production design uses the towering, chaotic structure of the woods to disrupt the Imperial sense of order. When Imperial ATST walkers, symbols of high-tier, rigid, synthetic power, enter the forest, they become cumbersome and visually disjointed. Their angular, metallic forms are visually swallowed by the organic chaos of the canopy, turning the environment itself into a weapon against the technological superiority of the antagonist. This geography of navigation forces the Empire to move through the terrain in the same clumsy, vulnerable manner as their counterparts, stripped of the frictionless efficiency they enjoy in space. The film utilizes wide-angle compositions and massive practical set extensions to emphasize this disparity between the individual and the system. When characters are framed against the backdrop of the Death Star's interior, they are visually trapped by the repetition of lines and the oppressive weight of the metal surroundings, which diminishes their agency. Conversely, when the focus shifts to the organic environments, the camera adopts a more fluid, reactive movement, tracking the characters through the brush and rubble. This movement captures the resilience of the individual spirit against a system that seeks to categorize and finalize human existence. The visual geography of the film is ultimately a negotiation between the desire for rigid, static perfection and the messy, vital reality of the living world. By anchoring its final resolution in the heart of a chaotic, natural environment, Return of the Jedi asserts that the ultimate defeat of a totalizing system occurs only when the sterile, artificial structures of the Empire are forced to contend with the unpredictable, organic complexity of the wild. Epistemology, information, and society. Return of the Jedi functions as a profound meditation on the collapse of an imposed, monolithic reality and the necessity of subjective moral reclamation. While often categorized as a grand spectacle of rebellion, the film is essentially an epistemological struggle in which the protagonist must decouple his identity from a state-sponsored meta-narrative. The Galactic Empire maintains its authority not merely through military coercion, but through a rigid monopolization of history and truth. By presenting the Emperor as the singular architect of fate and the Jedi as an extinct, chaotic relic, the regime constructs an environment where dissent is rendered intellectually impossible for the average citizen. The film reveals that the Empire's power rests on its ability to command the baseline of perception. Within the stark, sterile corridors of the Death Star, information is strictly partitioned, ensuring that the inhabitants function within a closed-loop feedback system of order. This propaganda engine functions by erasing the nuances of the past, replacing them with a binary of imperial stability versus fringe insurrection. Luke Skywalker enters this world as a subject of a fragmented, unreliable history. His initial understanding of his own lineage, mediated entirely through the filtered testimonies of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, is a manufactured myth designed to force his compliance with a specific tactical agenda. The epistemic fracture occurs when Luke realizes that his mentors, much like the Emperor, were willing to sacrifice his agency for the sake of an ideological end. The film's genius lies in how it manifests this internal conflict through its architectural and visual geography. The throne room of the second Death Star serves as the epicenter of this top-down, authoritarian control. It is a space of extreme sensory deprivation and sharp, unforgiving geometry. In contrast, the natural world of Endor offers a messy, pluralistic alternative where the Ewoks exist entirely outside the Empire's systems of categorization and value extraction. The Ewoks are the ultimate outgroup. They are ignored by Imperial intelligence because they operate on a logic that the Empire cannot compute or monetize. Their victory is not a fluke of scale but a triumph of decentralized, organic existence over a rigid, top-down machine. By bringing the conflict to a forest moon, the film forces the high-tech, data-driven machinery of the Empire into a space where it lacks the vocabulary to function. Luke's journey culminates in the rejection of the binary choices presented to him by both sides. When he throws away his lightsaber before the Emperor, he is making a definitive break from the logic of power, retribution, and kinetic exchange. He recognizes that the Emperor's attempt to bait him into a vengeful strike is a trap designed to confirm the regime's own worldview, that all living things are motivated by self-interest and aggression. By refusing to engage in the dialectic of the combatants, Luke creates a new epistemological state. He ceases to be a pawn in a galactic meta-narrative and becomes an individual agent who dictates his own moral terms. Technically, the film utilizes the juxtaposition of deep space coldness and lush, terrestrial warmth to mirror this shift. The shift from the claustrophobic, monochrome interiors of the Death Star to the vibrant, chaotic ecosystem of Endor emphasizes the film's thesis that life cannot be fully governed by the cold calculation of a centralized state. The visual effects team's commitment to layering practical puppets and physical environments into the composite frames allows for a tactile reality that contrasts with the synthetic perfection the Empire strives to project. Ultimately, Return of the Jedi is an argument for the supremacy of human connection over historical determinism. The redemption of Darth Vader serves as the final proof that no individual is permanently encoded by the history they have served. When Luke looks past the mask, literally destroying the visual interface of his father's identity, he acknowledges the humanity buried beneath the state's hardware. The film leaves the viewer with the recognition that authority is an illusion sustained only by the consensus of those it governs. Once the individual stops accepting the definitions imposed by the ruling class, the entire structure loses its power. The ending is not a return to a pre-existing state of grace, but a fundamental disruption of the power cycle, suggesting that true freedom is found in the ability to construct a personal morality that exists entirely independent of state-mandated truth. The struggle, even in its ambiguity, is the only legitimate source of meaning in a world of fabricated realities. Friction, law, and the catalyst. Return of the Jedi posits that the true mechanism of revolution lies not in the destruction of grand symbols, but in the internal reclamation of the individual soul from the architectures of systemic conditioning. While the film is often viewed through the lens of a rebellion against a singular, autocratic monolith, it functions primarily as a psychological inquiry into how authoritarian systems manufacture their own destruction by demanding total, unwavering subjugation from their subjects. The Empire operates as a hyper-rationalized, top-down state where law and physical reality are dictated by the absolute authority of the Emperor, creating an environment where the individual is treated as an interchangeable unit in a massive, cold-blooded machine. The sociological environment is defined by this rigid hierarchy, where power is manifested through sterile, gargantuan architecture and the total centralization of technological assets. In the imperial centers, the design aesthetic emphasizes sharp, metallic lines, echoing a desire for order that suppresses the organic chaos of life. This creates a baseline reality of stark, frictionless spaces that contrast sharply with the cluttered, tactile reality of the outer rims. The Empire functions by monopolizing the very definition of truth, positioning itself as the sole provider of order and, by extension, survival. Punishment within this framework is purely transactional. It is designed to extract value from the offender or eradicate the anomaly entirely. When the system faces a threat, it responds with an escalation of force, failing to realize that its reliance on fear-based control is the very catalyst that drives the protagonist to reject the systemic logic that attempts to define him. Luke Skywalker's journey is defined by an epistemic fracture that occurs as he moves from a reactive soldier to a conscious moral agent. Early in the film, he operates within the tactical logic of the rebellion, viewing the conflict through the binary, strategic lens of his superiors. This changes when he is forced to confront the reality of his own lineage and the realization that his struggle is deeply personal rather than merely tactical. The film tracks the limits of his language as he attempts to define his identity against the dark, pre-programmed destiny laid out by his father. His cognitive dissonance peaks during his final encounter with the Emperor, where he recognizes that the Empire's demand for his hatred, the essential tool of the dark side, is a trap designed to fold him into their systemic cycle of power. By discarding his lightsaber, Luke rejects the utilitarian violence demanded by both sides, opting for an act of radical vulnerability that destroys the Emperor's logic from within. The technical execution of this final act is a masterclass in spatial psychology. The Emperor's throne room serves as a claustrophobic, liminal space where the physical geography enforces the power dynamics at play. The VFX and cinematography focus on the isolation of the characters, stripping away the grand spectacle of space battles to focus on the intimate, often uncomfortable reality of familial confrontation. The sound design underscores this shift, moving from the cacophony of massive fleet maneuvers to the unsettling, cavernous silence of the throne room. This silence acts as a void, forcing the characters, and the audience, to confront the moral vacuum at the heart of the imperial state. The lighting, defined by the sharp, artificial glare of the station and the ethereal, flickering energy of the Force, creates a visual language of impending dissolution. The film operates on the philosophical premise that existence cannot be reduced to a binary of order versus chaos. Darth Vader stands as the primary antagonist, a manifestation of what happens when the individual becomes fully subsumed by the state. His existence is defined by his loss of agency, a tragic case of physical and psychological assimilation where his identity has been erased and replaced by the requirements of the system. His path serves as a mirror for Luke, demonstrating that the collapse of such a rigid hierarchy is inevitable when it creates an environment that demands the death of the subject's humanity. The climactic moment of redemption is not merely a moral victory, it is a structural collapse of the ideological apparatus the Emperor has painstakingly built. By choosing to sacrifice his own position to save his son, Vader breaks the cycle of control, proving that the individual's capacity for love acts as a permanent, non-conformable variable that no authoritarian construct can calculate or sustain. Ultimately, Return of the Jedi concludes with the dissolution of the imperial metanarrative. The final celebration suggests that the end of the state's monopoly on power allows for the re-emergence of organic, diverse communities. The film argues that systemic stability is a grand, fragile illusion sustained by the suppression of individual conscience. By the final frame, the narrative shifts from the impersonal scale of galactic conquest to the personal scale of reconciliation, confirming that the true victory resides in the refusal to be transformed into a component of the system. The struggle proves that the system's tendency toward totalizing control inevitably generates the very individual consciousness that will eventually disassemble it, marking the end of one era and the uncertain, yet human, beginning of another. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. Return of the Jedi serves as a profound meditation on the reconstruction of the self following the total dissolution of an identity-defining metanarrative. For Luke Skywalker, the journey is an exercise in navigating the void left by the collapse of his prior understanding of lineage and moral certainty. His evolution is marked by an epistemic fracture that occurs early in the film, specifically during his confrontation with the spirit of Obi-Wan Kenobi. When Luke learns the truth about his sister and the necessity of confronting his father, his previous understanding of his path, one defined by the simplistic binary of rebellion against a faceless, villainous regime, is rendered obsolete. He is forced to replace the external, myth-driven quest for Jedi glory with an internal, harrowing commitment to familial salvation. This transition marks the point where his fabricated ego, constructed from the heroic tropes of his mentors, disintegrates to reveal the raw, vulnerable individual beneath. This internal shift is most evident in the tension between Luke's verbal commitments and his silence. Throughout his interaction with Yoda and the reappearing Kenobi, Luke is trapped by the restrictive language of the Jedi Order. He is expected to operate within a vocabulary of detachment and cold, strategic utility, terms that are insufficient to address the depth of his trauma. He cannot voice the profound cognitive dissonance he experiences. He is simultaneously expected to be the galaxy's savior and an executioner who must strike down his own father. His silence in the presence of his friends, particularly during the final assault on the second Death Star, functions as a containment vessel for his internal conflict. He is no longer the wide-eyed farm boy reacting to external stimuli, he is an agent of his own philosophy, one that diverges from the institutional expectations of his predecessors. The film's focus on the shadow further emphasizes this journey toward self-integration. Darth Vader acts as the literal manifestation of Luke's repressed potential and the terrifying logical conclusion of his own anger. The mirror dynamic between the two is not a battle of ideologies, but a confrontation with a projected flaw. Luke recognizes that by acting as a judge and executioner, he risks becoming the very entity he seeks to destroy. His refusal to strike down Vader, even when goaded by the Emperor, is the ultimate act of self-actualization. By throwing away his weapon, Luke rejects the systemic programming of the Jedi, choosing instead to embrace a path of vulnerability. He proves that the strength of the self is not derived from the power to inflict order upon the galaxy, but from the refusal to allow the system to commodify his own agency. This rejection of the heroic machine is a somatic experience that culminates in the throne room. The trauma Luke carries is physical, manifest in his own prosthetic hand, which mirrors the mechanical reality of his father. By looking at his own hand after his victory, Luke recognizes that he is not a god or a myth, but a person forged in the fires of a brutal, deterministic struggle. The visual language of the film reinforces this. He is constantly dwarfed by the massive, synthetic environments of the Death Star, yet his final, quiet movements before the Emperor reveal a character who has outgrown the need for the epic stage. He finds his equilibrium not in the total victory of the rebellion, but in the small, intimate reclamation of his father's humanity. Ultimately, Return of the Jedi argues that the individual's moral worth is established in the refusal to be a cog in a grand, state-sponsored narrative. Luke's journey is one of shedding the identities imposed upon him by the state, the religion, and the war machine. He concludes the film as a figure who has successfully navigated the absurdity of his upbringing and the weight of his legacy. His story is an existential triumph. He constructs a meaning that is entirely his own, one that honors the complexity of his history without being enslaved by it. The film leaves the viewer with the understanding that the most profound act of resistance is the preservation of one's own conscience in a world designed to extinguish it. Luke emerges not as a legend, but as an integrated human, a person who has finally stepped out from the shadow of the metanarrative to inhabit the truth of his own existence. Trauma and somatic experiencing. The narrative of Return of the Jedi functions as a profound excavation of the somatic and psychological residue left by a cycle of inherited violence. While the surface-level discourse centers on the cosmic conflict between light and dark, the film's true weight rests upon the fragile, reconstructed bodies of its protagonists and antagonists. Luke Skywalker's journey culminates not merely in a moral victory, but in a visceral confrontation with the physical manifestation of his own potential for destruction. His foundational trauma, the severing of his hand in the previous installment, serves as the primary catalyst for his internal destabilization. Throughout the film, this wound is never fully integrated into his identity. Instead, it exists as a site of constant, silent agitation. When Luke stares at his synthetic hand, he is witnessing the literal hybridization of his humanity with the machinery of the Empire. This prosthetic limb is the locus of his somatic memory, a cold, unfeeling apparatus that reminds him, with every flex of a mechanical finger, of his proximity to his father's path. Darth Vader, conversely, represents the ultimate endpoint of somatic surrender. His existence is defined by the total replacement of flesh with life support hardware, a transition that has locked him into a state of perpetual, agonizing maintenance. The film posits that Vader's trauma is stored within the rhythmic, suffocating respiration that serves as his only true voice. This mechanical breathing is a sonic anchor, tying him to the charred remains of his former self. For Vader, the body is a prison of iron and circuitry, a shell constructed to contain the immense, volatile energy he can no longer channel through organic means. The tragedy of his character is that he has treated his physicality as a disposable commodity, allowing the state to rebuild him in its own image. His loyalty to the Emperor is an extension of this commodification. He protects the system that sustains his own life support systems, trapped in a symbiotic reliance where his very heartbeat is controlled by the architect of his servitude. The interaction between Luke and Vader functions as a dangerous repetition compulsion. Luke, in his quest to confront the darkness, constantly positions himself in environments that mirror the geography of his original trauma. By returning to the Emperor's throne room, Luke places himself within the physical shadow of the state, recreating the conditions of his previous defeat to test his newfound self-regulation. His coping mechanism is initially dissociative, masked by a cool, monastic detachment, a Jedi stoicism intended to keep his fear at bay. However, this facade fractures the moment Vader invokes the memory of his sister. The resulting explosion of violence is a somatic release, a primal urge to destroy the source of his pain. In these moments, Luke's actions mirror his father's earlier cruelty, suggesting that the trauma is not simply a memory but a hereditary infection. The film reveals that true healing requires the shedding of the synthetic self. When Luke rejects the Emperor's command to kill his father, he is not merely making a moral choice, he is actively refusing the logic of his own augments. He throws his lightsaber away, discarding the tool that links his mechanical hand to the cycle of violence. This gesture is an act of somatic reclamation. By choosing to face death as a vulnerable, organic being rather than an armed, reinforced combatant, Luke severs the repetition compulsion that has defined his lineage. Vader's ultimate redemption is similarly defined by a return to the physical. When he finally turns against the Emperor, his act of violence is a manual, human labor. He lifts the tyrant with his own failing mechanical strength and casts him into the void. This final, exertion-heavy struggle leads to the removal of his mask, the shedding of the synthetic armor, and the exposure of the raw, aging skin beneath. The film presents this return to the organic, to the fragile, dying face of a father, as the only possible path toward reconciling with the past. The trauma is finally metabolized not through conquest, but through the relinquishment of the power that the machinery of the state provided. By embracing his own fragility and mortality, Vader completes the transition from an agent of the state back into an individual, proving that identity exists beyond the limits of the mechanical shell. In this final silence, the characters achieve a resolution that is deeply grounded in the physical reality of their bodies, having survived the systems that sought to consume them. The Shadow and the Antagonist. In the final movement of the original trilogy, the conflict between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader transcends the tropes of galactic insurgency to become a harrowing study of the Jungian shadow. Vader functions as the literal manifestation of Luke's repressed potential, the dark, authoritative capacity for violence and absolute control that Luke must acknowledge to complete his transition into a fully realized self. Throughout the film, the Emperor serves as the architect of a reality that demands the total surrender of the individual to the collective machinery of the state, but it is Vader who remains the mirror for Luke's own capacity for rage. By forcing Luke to confront the man he could become, the film suggests that the hero's path is not one of purification, but of integration. Luke recognizes that the darkness he fears in the galaxy is already woven into the fabric of his own lineage. Vader's internal logic operates with chilling consistency, anchored in a philosophy of order that views the chaos of democratic struggle as a fundamental failure of governance. From his epistemological vantage point, the galaxy is a system requiring the firm, immutable hand of a singular will to prevent the degradation of society into tribalism and anarchy. He does not view himself as a villain, but as a stabilizing force, a pragmatist who has traded the ephemeral warmth of human empathy for the cold, predictable efficiency of total authority. This perspective makes him a terrifyingly coherent figure, one who views Luke's idealistic rebellion as a naive refusal to accept the harsh, systemic necessities of galactic management. The film structures this confrontation through the presence of secondary figures who act as mirrors, specifically the Emperor. If Luke and Vader represent the struggle between human emotion and its suppression, the Emperor represents the final stage of that process, the complete eradication of the human element. The Emperor has successfully severed his connection to his own shadow, existing only as a manifestation of pure, unadulterated power. In contrast, Luke is placed in a position where he must either emulate the Emperor's detachment to achieve victory or remain tethered to his humanity at the risk of total annihilation. The tragedy of the film's central dynamic is that the Empire is built on a parasitic structure. The Emperor feeds on the emotional capital of his subordinates, draining them of their identity until they are merely extensions of his will. Luke, however, offers a symbiotic alternative, suggesting that the only way to defeat a parasitic system is through an authentic connection that recognizes the value of the other, even when that other is an adversary. This interpersonal tension is exacerbated by Luke's tendency to project his own insecurities onto those around him. In his initial return to Dagobah, Luke's impatience and burgeoning arrogance reveal a young man terrified of the very power he is destined to wield. He projects his anxiety about his own susceptibility to corruption onto Vader, treating his father as an external threat to be destroyed rather than a reflection of his own inherent capability. It is only when he drops the performative armor of the Jedi, abandoning the weapon that defines him as a warrior, that he finally sees the truth of his situation. By choosing to discard the sword, Luke refuses to replicate the cycle of violence that birthed his father's darkness, effectively breaking the pattern of repetition that the Empire relies upon to perpetuate its survival. The climactic moment of the duel is a triumph of psychological awareness over systemic coercion. When Luke looks upon his father and declares, "I am a Jedi, like my father before me," he is not simply stating an allegiance, he is performing an act of radical empathy. He accepts the totality of his father's history, including the atrocities, as part of his own identity. This is the moment where the shadow is fully integrated. Luke realizes that his goodness is not defined by the absence of darkness, but by his choice to hold that darkness in check. The film demonstrates that the human element, the ability to act with compassion despite the systemic pressures to do otherwise, is the only force capable of collapsing the Empire's rigid, mechanistic structure. By acknowledging his father's humanity, Luke renders the Emperor's propaganda obsolete, proving that no amount of technological or political dominance can suppress the fundamental, volatile reality of human connection. The victory is not found in the destruction of the Death Star, but in the survival of the soul within the machine. The visual proof of the psyche. Return of the Jedi functions as a profound study of the human psyche under the weight of predetermined destiny, manifesting as a visual reclamation of the self from systemic erasure. The film operates on the thesis that true agency is only achieved when the individual strips away the layers of institutional indoctrination and confronts the fractured mirror of their own trauma. While the surface narrative frames the film as a grand cosmic crusade, the psychological core remains rooted in the intimate, often agonizing process of personal reconciliation, where characters navigate the wreckage of their own identities to forge a coherent, autonomous existence. The film's visual language utilizes isolation as a primary tool for psychological excavation. Luke Skywalker is consistently placed within environments that emphasize his ontological loneliness, whether he is dwarfed by the cavernous, oppressive architecture of the Emperor's throne room or framed against the infinite, sterile emptiness of space. These compositions force a focus on his internal state. The massive, dark environments act as physical manifestations of the shadow he must confront. By shrinking the human figure against the backdrop of an authoritarian industrial design, the camera highlights the fragility of the individual spirit tasked with dismantling a monolithic state. This isolation is punctuated by the recurring motif of the uncanny nature of power. The Emperor, and by extension the dark side, represents a form of existence that has become entirely systematic and robotic. His presence is characterized by a lack of vulnerability. He operates as a pure, pre-programmed expression of malice. When characters face him, the film emphasizes a sharp divide between the performative, public nature of political rhetoric and the raw, vulnerable reality of personal choice. Luke's journey is defined by his transition from the performative, the heroic Jedi persona he has been conditioned to inhabit, to a state of total transparency, where he discards the artifice of his station to embrace his fallibility as a human being. Trauma in the film is not merely a backstory but a physical presence stored within the characters' bodies. Luke's mechanical hand serves as a constant, tactile reminder of his core wound, a physical manifestation of the cost of his proximity to evil. This prosthetic limb is more than just a biological replacement, it is the physical anchor for his repetition compulsion, a tangible piece of the antagonist integrated into his own physiology. He spends the film attempting to control this trauma, seeking to master the very darkness that claimed his father. The tension arises from his refusal to allow this physical trauma to dictate his moral trajectory, marking the film as a testament to the effort required to break cycles of violence that are inscribed into the very flesh of the survivor. The film's climax is an exercise in the destruction of the ego. When the final facade of the Jedi warrior drops, we see Luke not as a savior, but as a vulnerable agent of change who accepts his own potential for destruction. The visual imagery of this moment, the unmasking of Vader, mirrors the internal disintegration of the character's projected selves. By seeing the physical, rotting reality beneath the mask, Luke acknowledges that the grand narratives of good and evil are secondary to the interpersonal reality of familial connection and individual choice. This is the moment where the meta-narrative of the Chosen One collapses in favor of an existential, human act of mercy. The technical execution of these themes relies on a deliberate manipulation of space and light to mirror the psyche. The lighting in the final act, shifting from the harsh, cold sterility of the Death Star to the warm, organic glow of the Endor victory, signifies the externalization of an internal triumph. The film posits that the environment is secondary to the resolution of the character's internal conflict. By the end, the system of the Empire has been dismantled not through superior military force, but through a radical pivot in the protagonist's understanding of himself. Return of the Jedi stands as an exploration of the triumph of human agency, asserting that even in a galaxy defined by rigid systems and inescapable legacies, the individual possesses the final authority to determine their own moral existence. The film concludes not by celebrating a new order, but by witnessing the quiet, transformative birth of a subject who has finally moved beyond the constraints of their own history. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. Return of the Jedi functions as a profound inquiry into the nature of epistemology, asserting that truth is fundamentally an act of internal revelation rather than an external discovery mediated by authority. The film rejects the notion that reality is defined by the governing power structures, the Galactic Empire or the Jedi Council, and instead proposes that one's understanding of the world is limited only by the boundaries of one's own moral clarity. The Empire maintains its hold on the galaxy through a rigid, top-down epistemic authority that equates truth with state-sanctioned information, effectively turning the galaxy into a space where dissent is synonymous with cognitive dissonance. By placing the burden of truth on the individual, the film posits that true knowledge emerges only when the subject transcends the binary narratives offered by their superiors. The discourse within the film is deeply rooted in the concept of the self-constructed reality. Luke Skywalker's journey represents an evolution from accepting a mediated history, initially provided by Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, to achieving a state of authentic, unmediated truth. The initial framing of the conflict, wherein the Jedi present the killing of Darth Vader as an objective necessity, serves as an ideological state apparatus designed to align Luke with a specific tactical outcome. However, the film demonstrates that this moral framework is incomplete. Luke's ultimate refusal to succumb to the demands of the Force, as it is articulated by both his mentors and his antagonist, marks the point where his language of morality expands beyond their restrictive vocabularies. He occupies a state of epistemic autonomy, identifying that the truth of his father's humanity resides outside the linguistic constraints of Sith or Jedi. The film visualizes the collision of these competing truths through its structural design, specifically in the juxtaposition of the sterile, monochromatic architecture of the Death Star and the organic, sensory-rich environment of Endor. The Empire's reality is one of mathematical precision and cold industrial logic, representing a worldview where everything is known, categorized, and commodified into military value. In contrast, the Ewoks and the natural world of Endor operate on a level of primitive, intuitive connection that eludes the technological gatekeeping of the Empire. This disparity serves as a critique of how information is processed. The Empire relies on the exhaustive data of its scanning technology and strategic interfaces, yet it remains blind to the reality of the uprising occurring right before its senses. The imperial epistemic authority fails precisely because it assumes that the world can be completely decoded through observation, failing to account for the irrational, non-quantifiable nature of the human spirit. Furthermore, Return of the Jedi engages with a form of Cartesian inquiry concerning the nature of the self. Luke's descent into the Emperor's throne room is a trial of perception. He is confronted with the reality of his own potential for darkness, a truth that challenges his ego and his previous certainty regarding his own identity. The film suggests that the truth of a character is not an objective constant but a fragile construct that requires constant re-evaluation. When Vader and the Emperor speak, they operate within a language of absolute certainty, viewing the future as a closed system of cause and effect. Luke's resistance to this determinism, choosing to discard his weapon, is an assertion that he is the final arbiter of his own existence. He rejects the post-truth environment of the Empire, where the Emperor shapes reality through manipulation and selective information, choosing instead to anchor himself in an ethical stance that defies the binary calculations of his enemy. The synthesis of this philosophical arc is found in the final confrontation, where the destruction of the Death Star is merely a physical manifestation of the preceding epistemic collapse. The death of the Emperor is not merely the defeat of a political leader, it is the dissolution of a false, all-encompassing narrative. The film concludes with a celebration that is fundamentally grounded in the restoration of individual perspective. By focusing on the faces of those who were once blinded by the imperial apparatus, the ending signifies a collective liberation from a single, imposed history. Return of the Jedi argues that society functions only when the individual refuses to outsource their moral judgment to an external authority, proving that the most significant battles are fought not in the corridors of power, but in the quiet, internal realization of what is genuinely true. The film establishes a legacy of existential hope, insisting that when the grand narratives of control fail, the individual capacity for truth serves as the only stable foundation for a new, post-imperial reality. Meta-narratives and social theory. Return of the Jedi functions as a sophisticated examination of the collapse of grand narratives and the inherent instability of ideological state apparatuses within a galactic hegemony. The film begins with the Empire at the height of its administrative reach, maintaining order not merely through the kinetic violence of the Death Star, but through the projection of an inescapable, singular reality. The imperial hierarchy relies upon a rigid, top-down epistemic control, where the Emperor acts as the sole arbiter of truth, imposing a meta-narrative that defines the rebellion as a chaotic, localized symptom of a failed past. By the film's conclusion, this structure suffers a total collapse, as the narrative of absolute imperial authority is revealed to be a fragile construct maintained only by the sustained belief of its adherents. The film explores the tension between the institutionalized dogma of the Sith and the increasingly decentralized, pluralistic nature of the disparate groups fighting to reclaim their sovereignty. The imperial system represents an extreme form of a failed grand narrative. It attempts to codify reality into a binary of order versus entropy. This is evidenced by the architectural and visual geography of the Death Star 2, an environment of sterile, cold symmetry where individuality is subordinated to the machine. The Empire utilizes its vast technological infrastructure as an ideological tool, where the scale of the architecture is designed to render the individual human experience irrelevant. The reliance on this hyper-rationalized, hyper-centralized power structure leaves the regime vulnerable to the unpredictability of human connection, which the film positions as the ultimate catalyst for systemic failure. Within this framework, the redemption of Anakin Skywalker serves as the final, absolute rejection of the imperial grand narrative. His transition from the embodiment of state-enforced, cold authoritarianism back to the restoration of personal, autonomous ethics mirrors the collapse of the ideological apparatus that sustained the Emperor. The Emperor, as the architect of this regime, represents a totalizing philosophy that equates existence with control and silence. His destruction is not merely a tactical victory for the rebels but an ontological one, signifying the dissolution of a singular, state-imposed definition of the Force and, by extension, the universe itself. The film posits that the moral health of a society is predicated on the ability of the individual to act outside of the predetermined, self-correcting feedback loops established by the ruling power. The rebellion succeeds because it embraces a distributed model of agency, one that acknowledges the diverse perspectives of Ewoks, smugglers, and Jedi alike. This pluralism acts as a direct counter-strategy to the Empire's homogenized control. The film frames the liberation of the galaxy as a shift from a closed, dogmatic, and ultimately decaying system to an open, dynamic state where the future is no longer governed by a singular, rigid teleology. The final scenes, emphasizing communal celebration, visually reinforce the transition from the sterile, vertical hierarchy of the Empire to a horizontal, integrated collective. Through this process, Return of the Jedi asserts that the true power of a civilization lies in its capacity for renewal through the rejection of singular, oppressive belief systems, ultimately framing the dismantling of the state apparatus as the essential prerequisite for genuine human and galactic progress. The narrative arc moves definitively toward the decentralization of power, proving that the most stable form of existence is one that refuses to be constrained by the dictates of a manufactured, totalizing order. Ethics and the moral calculus. Return of the Jedi functions as a rigorous examination of moral agency, positing that true ethical victory resides in the refusal to adopt the dehumanizing tactics of the oppressor. The film's central moral calculus centers on the rejection of utilitarian logic, which the Galactic Empire employs as a justification for systemic cruelty. The Emperor and Darth Vader operate within a paradigm where individual lives are treated as expendable variables in an equation designed to secure absolute order. By contrast, Luke Skywalker's journey culminates in a definitive break from this utilitarian trap. He recognizes that the survival of the rebellion and the restoration of a just republic cannot be bought at the cost of his own moral integrity. When Luke discards his lightsaber before the Emperor, he enacts a radical form of deontology. He asserts that there are absolute prohibitions against murder and hate, even when committing such acts would objectively serve the greater good of ending a tyrannical regime. This ethical stance forces a confrontation with the limits of moral identity. The film explores the possibility of redemption by positing that the capacity for moral change is inherent to consciousness itself, rather than a fixed state determined by past actions. Anakin Skywalker's return to the light represents the triumph of individual agency over deterministic systems. By killing the Emperor, Anakin does not simply perform a utilitarian calculation to save his son, he completes a profound internal shift by reclaiming his identity as a person capable of love. This underscores the film's assertion that personhood, whether biological or cybernetic, is defined by the ability to choose empathy over self-preservation. Even the non-human entities within the narrative, from the droid companions to the Ewoks, are granted full moral standing, reinforcing the idea that the ethical community in this universe is universal and unconditional. The film effectively challenges the inevitability of the antagonist's worldview. The Emperor's logic is a closed loop. He believes that power, once acquired, must be exercised to crush all potential resistance. His perspective is entirely grounded in the material and the immediate, viewing the Force as a tool for domination. Luke's rebellion against this system is an act of Camusian defiance. He confronts the absurdity of a galaxy dominated by a Sith ideology that seeks to extinguish the self, yet he refuses to be consumed by that darkness. Instead of adopting the cold, pragmatic violence of the Sith to win, Luke finds meaning in the act of resistance itself. His refusal to strike down his father constitutes a victory because it affirms a code of ethics that exists independently of the state of the war. This approach highlights the critical distinction between the means and the ends. The rebellion acts with the knowledge that a victory achieved through the same methods as the Empire would render the subsequent peace illegitimate. The film argues that the moral quality of an outcome is inextricably linked to the moral quality of the actions taken to reach it. When Luke chooses to embrace his vulnerability rather than his power, he effectively dismantles the ideological framework of the Empire. The Emperor's failure is rooted in his inability to comprehend a motive beyond the desire for power. He cannot account for a character who values the sanctity of life more than the tactical success of the mission. Ultimately, Return of the Jedi portrays a universe where morality is not a luxury, but a foundational requirement for existence. The characters who succeed are those who manage to integrate their trauma without being defined by it, allowing them to make choices that serve the future rather than the scars of the past. The moral weight of the narrative rests on the conviction that the individual possessor of conscience has the power to shatter even the most entrenched systems of control. By placing the burden of choice squarely on the protagonist, the film confirms that ethical progress is an active, ongoing struggle rather than an automatic result of defeating a villain. The resolution is not merely a triumph of arms, but a profound demonstration of the necessity of maintaining one's humanity in the face of an existential threat. Determinism, agency, and time. Return of the Jedi functions as a sophisticated exploration of the tension between predetermined destiny and the radical, unpredictable nature of individual agency. Within the galaxy's power structure, the narrative presents a deterministic reality governed by the Force, an omniscient energy field that binds all things and often appears to dictate the trajectory of history. The Jedi and the Sith both view themselves as instruments of this grand design, operating under the assumption that the future is a tapestry already woven. Yet, the film repeatedly undermines this fatalism by placing the climax of the conflict not in the strategic maneuvering of the rebel fleet or the logistical strength of the Empire, but in the internal, localized choices of a single individual. The film establishes a universe defined by systemic inevitability. The Emperor acts as the architect of a rigid, top-down structure, banking on the idea that human behavior, driven by fear, power, and the accumulation of resources, is a mathematical certainty. He views Luke Skywalker as a predictable variable, a successor who will naturally succumb to the pull of the dark side because history demands that the son replaces the father in a cycle of violence. This structuralist view suggests that the individual is merely a temporary occupant of a predetermined role. In this framework, the Empire functions as a self-correcting mechanism where rebellion is anticipated, monitored, and ultimately absorbed into the greater logic of total control. However, the film locates true power in the rejection of this preordained path. When Luke Skywalker encounters his father, Darth Vader, in the Emperor's throne room, he exists in a space where the grand narrative of the war becomes irrelevant. Here, the struggle shifts from a political uprising to an existential reckoning. Luke's decision to cast aside his lightsaber is the ultimate assertion of agency. By refusing to participate in the cycle of violence, he breaks the deterministic loop that the Emperor relied upon to secure his rule. This act of nonviolence is not an expression of weakness, but a profound declaration that the individual possesses the capacity to negate the dictates of a pre-written destiny. Luke chooses to face death rather than confirm the Emperor's worldview, thereby proving that human conscience can exist outside the parameters of the system. Darth Vader's own trajectory further complicates the notion of predestination. For decades, he is presented as a tragic automaton, a man whose humanity has been systematically hollowed out by the requirements of his office. He is the ultimate example of the individual subsumed by the system. Yet, his final choice to intervene on behalf of his son demonstrates that the potential for moral reorientation remains an inherent, if dormant, human trait. This internal shift renders the Emperor's vast technological and political machinery obsolete. The fall of the Empire is not the result of a military victory alone, but the inevitable consequence of a system failing to account for the irrationality of love and the autonomy of the human spirit. The film suggests that true freedom is the burden of choosing against one's own programming. While the rebellion operates on a strategic, macro level, battling for the fate of planets and the restoration of a republic, the film's philosophical weight is carried by the quiet, intensely personal moments of decision-making. The characters, particularly Luke, Leia, and Vader, demonstrate that while their environment and history shape their circumstances, they are not chained to the outcomes these factors imply. The film champions an existential hope, arguing that the struggle for moral clarity is an end in itself. Ultimately, Return of the Jedi concludes that the universe is not a rigid clockwork mechanism, but a fluid landscape shaped by the cumulative force of individual choices. The collapse of the Empire is the collapse of a singular, totalizing perspective. By the final scene, the galaxy is no longer under the shadow of a monolithic, predictable future. The absence of the Emperor leaves behind a state of genuine uncertainty, which the film presents as the necessary condition for true freedom. The heroes stand on the precipice of a new, unwritten reality, having successfully navigated the tension between their inherited burdens and their capacity to forge a path that the system never accounted for. The transition from the rigid order of the imperial throne room to the organic, chaotic celebration on Endor serves as a visual testament to the victory of the individual over the system. The conflict ends not because the struggle is finished, but because the characters have regained the right to define the future for themselves. Part 5, The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. Return of the Jedi employs a rigorous visual language that functions as a structural map for its central conflict, transforming the frame into a definitive gauge of moral and political power. Throughout the film, the cinematography establishes a clear hierarchy of space where the verticality of the Emperor's throne room or the expansive, sterile vistas of the second Death Star dictate the dominance of the Empire. The camera consistently adopts low-angle compositions when framing the Imperial High Command, anchoring them within the geometry of their own architecture to signify an absolute, unyielding authority. Conversely, the rebellion is frequently captured through more fluid, kinetic movements, mirroring the organic chaos of their insurgency. This spatial language reinforces a world where the Empire occupies the position of the static, immovable object, while the protagonist and his allies are defined by their necessary mobility. The movement of the camera serves as an active participant in the film's emotional geography. During the intimate exchanges between Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, the lens transitions from a detached, objective observer into a claustrophobic, subjective witness. As these encounters unfold, the camera tracks with a deliberate, smooth precision that mimics the calculated nature of the Force, eventually tightening its focus to emphasize the internal friction of the characters. By utilizing long, sustained takes during the final confrontation, the film strips away the rhythmic safety of conventional editing, forcing the viewer to inhabit the exact, suffocating environment where the protagonist's ego must be dismantled. The camera does not merely record the action, it compresses the space around the participants, turning the throne room into a crucible where the psychological weight of the past manifests as a tangible physical pressure. The color palette architecture of the film functions as a roadmap for the protagonist's transition toward his final synthesis. The early sequences in Jabba's palace utilize a saturated, visceral spectrum of decay, dull ambers, bruised purples, and deep, muddy browns, to visualize the moral rot of the underworld. As the narrative progresses toward the final conflict, these hues are systematically replaced by the stark, binary opposition of clinical white, deep shadow, and the sharp, piercing crimson of the Emperor's presence. This shift in color serves as a visual indicator of the soul's refinement. The saturation fades as the stakes become purely existential, stripping the environment of artifice until only the essential colors remain. The pervasive use of deep blacks and artificial, harsh light creates a chiaroscuro effect that highlights the duality inherent in the central characters, suggesting that the shadow is not a separate entity but an integrated component of the self, revealed clearly only when the distracting clutter of the wider galaxy is removed. Depth and negative space are leveraged to articulate the isolation of the individual caught within a massive, systemic machine. When Luke stands before the Emperor, he is often framed against the vast, dark emptiness of the observation window, dwarfed by the scale of the Death Star's interior. This use of negative space emphasizes his profound solitude, highlighting that his ultimate choice is not a collective action, but a singular, internal reckoning. By pressing the characters against the cold, metal surfaces of the station, the composition visually traps them within the structures they aim to destroy, illustrating the reality that their struggle is conducted entirely within the belly of their enemy. The motif of light acts as the film's final arbiter of truth. While the artificial, sterile glow of the space station illuminates the surface of the conflict, it is the soft, naturalistic lighting present in the final moments that signals the dissolution of the fabricated ego. The transition from the harsh, high-contrast lighting of the throne room, where the light is used as a tool of the Empire to expose and judge, to the gentle, flickering luminescence of the funeral pyre serves as a profound visual release. In this transition, light ceases to be a weapon of control and becomes a medium of transformation. The technical precision of these shots provides the visual proof of a completed arc, confirming that the protagonist's journey toward internal coherence has successfully rewritten the reality of the scene. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. Return of the Jedi serves as a monumental achievement in the history of practical effects, standing as a tactile testament to the power of physical craftsmanship. The film achieves its immersive quality by anchoring every fantastical element in a tangible, decaying reality, ensuring that the visual effects function as extensions of the set design rather than interruptions to the viewer's suspension of disbelief. The integration of the synthetic occurs through a meticulous synchronization of light. When the camera captures the interior of the second Death Star or the lush, foliage-heavy environments of Endor, the optical compositing, achieved through high-precision motion control photography, matches the ambient light of the practical sets with remarkable consistency. By maintaining consistent black levels and color temperatures between the foreground actors and the expansive matte paintings or miniature backgrounds, the film preserves a cohesive visual grammar that defines the galaxy as a singular, consistent location. The physics of the film's mechanical world are defined by a sense of genuine mass and weight. Whether it is the lumbering, heavy traversal of an AT-ST walker through the forest or the inertia-driven momentum of a TIE fighter weaving through the narrow corridors of the space station, the effects artists prioritized physical constraints over fluid, gravity-defying animation. Every digital adjacent effect, such as the laser bolts or the shimmering veil of the Force, is grounded in established environmental variables. A heavy object hitting a bulkhead results in a corresponding impact, complete with sparks, structural stress, and dust, allowing the viewer to perceive the scale of these constructs as dangerous and substantial. This adherence to physical reality creates a world where the stakes feel immediate. The machinery of the Empire is not a collection of abstract pixels, but a series of interconnected, grinding, and often failing mechanical systems. The film manages to bypass the pitfalls of the uncanny valley by prioritizing organic imperfections in its non-human creatures. The denizens of Jabba's palace represent the pinnacle of creature design, where the lack of digital artifice is replaced by the erratic, twitchy, and lifelike movements of animatronics. The eyes of Jabba the Hutt, for instance, retain their internal life because they reflect the actual lighting of the set, while the micro-movements of his skin, fold shifting with every rotation of his bulk, replicate the complex biology of a living being. This commitment to practical physicality ensures that the characters remain present within the space, preventing the visual disconnect that often arises when artificial characters interact with human leads. The life in these creatures is found in their texture, their slime, and their reaction to the physical light source, which effectively masks the artifice of the puppetry. Many of the most impressive technical feats in Return of the Jedi are found in the invisible work that bolsters the film's scope. Quiet effects, such as extensive set extensions in the Imperial throne room or crowd multiplication within the hangar bays, operate with such subtlety that they disappear into the composition. These elements expand the geography of the film, providing a sense of architectural vastness that would be impossible to build in its entirety. The production design utilizes these extensions to heighten the feeling of institutional hierarchy, where the characters are visually subordinated by the massive, oppressive scale of the environment. Because these elements are introduced without drawing attention to their synthetic nature, the film maintains a consistent level of grit and patina, ensuring that even the most futuristic locations feel lived in and weathered. The aesthetic of the film reflects a conscious economic choice to favor the high-cost, high-reward nature of practical photography. While the budget was substantial, the decision to invest in complex textures and optical layering produces a visual quality that remains timeless. The lighting is deliberate, using chiaroscuro to emphasize the moral divisions between the characters, with deep, cavernous shadows hiding the mechanics of the Empire while bright, natural light defines the rebellion's organic home. By opting for a tactile, material-based aesthetic, the film avoids the flat, weightless appearance that often plagues less grounded visual spectacles. This technical discipline reinforces the film's narrative thesis: the struggle against the Empire is a struggle between the cold, rigid, and artificial order of a manufactured system and the messy, authentic, and vibrant reality of living beings. In every frame, the craftsmanship confirms that the soul of the film resides in its physical weight, transforming the screen into a window onto a coherent, perilous, and ultimately tactile universe. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. Return of the Jedi achieves a profound sensory cohesion through the masterful synthesis of its sonic landscape and rhythmic structure. The film functions as an expansive, operatic environment where sound acts as the primary connective tissue between the disparate locales of its galaxy. This is most evident in the deliberate blurring of the line between diegetic and non-diegetic sound. John Williams' score does not merely accompany the action, it permeates the atmosphere of the film, frequently bleeding into the environmental noise. When Luke Skywalker encounters the spectral presence of Yoda or Obi-Wan, the score swells with ethereal textures that blend seamlessly into the natural ambient hum of the forest moon of Endor, suggesting that the Force is a physical resonance embedded within the film's reality. The sonic environment of the film is strategically designed to reflect the psychological state of its central characters. Within the claustrophobic, metallic confines of the Death Star, the sound mix is dense, aggressive, and industrial. The rhythmic clanking of machinery, the sharp hiss of pressurized air, and the high-frequency hum of electrical conduits create an overwhelming auditory experience that mirrors the intense pressure Luke faces while confronting his father. Conversely, the film utilizes silence as a potent weapon, particularly during pivotal moments of character revelation. During the final confrontation between Luke, Vader, and the Emperor, the sound mix often drops away, stripping the scene of the bombastic orchestral swells or industrial drone. This deliberate use of silence forces the viewer into the internal perspective of the protagonist, focusing the audience entirely on the intimate, whispered dialogue. In these moments, the silence highlights the emotional weight of the moral choices being made, transforming the throne room into a vacuum where only the fundamental truth of the characters' identities remains. The editing rhythm of Return of the Jedi serves as a precise metronome for the narrative's escalating stakes. As the film approaches its tripartite climax, the space battle above Endor, the ground assault on the shield generator, and the duel in the Emperor's throne room, the editing pattern becomes increasingly rapid and cross-cut. This increase in cut speed directly mimics the fracturing reality of the rebellion, which is stretched across multiple theaters of operation. By oscillating between the kinetic, high-speed maneuvers of the starfighters and the static, psychological tension of the lightsaber duel, the film forces the viewer to process the conflict as a singular, unified event. The temporal elasticity achieved through this editing style reinforces the film's argument that individual agency is inextricably linked to the broader, systemic collapse of the Empire. The audio perspective is carefully calibrated to reinforce character focus. When characters are internally conflicted, the sound mix often muffles the background noise of the world, creating a subjective auditory bubble. This technique is used to prioritize Luke's perspective during his most critical moments of doubt. As he stares into the void of the Emperor's influence, the ambient sounds of the Death Star, the crackle of energy, the distant alarms, recede, making the viewer feel the absolute isolation inherent in his choice to reject the dark side. This creates a powerful sensory paradox where the most chaotic environments become vehicles for profound stillness and personal transformation. By manipulating these auditory layers, the film ensures that the audience experiences the collapse of the Empire not just as a grand geopolitical event, but as a visceral, deeply felt shift in the consciousness of its protagonist. The craft of the sound design, therefore, acts as an essential pillar of the film's philosophical argument, grounding the metaphysical struggle of the Force in a tactile, undeniable sensory reality. Synthesis of craft. The final chapter of the original Star Wars trilogy represents a pinnacle of practical craft where technical artifice serves as the primary engine for internal character transformation. In Return of the Jedi, the synthesis of cinematography, optical printing, and sound design creates a world that moves from the claustrophobic, slime-choked darkness of Tatooine to the sterile, high-contrast geometry of the second Death Star. The film utilizes a deliberate lens strategy to mirror the maturation of its protagonists, where the early sequences in Jabba's palace employ wider, distorting lenses to emphasize the grotesque crowding and moral decay of the criminal underworld. The climactic confrontation in the Emperor's throne room shifts to longer, tighter focal lengths. This shift compresses the visual space between Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, and the Emperor, forcing the audience into a claustrophobic proximity that heightens the psychological stakes of their final exchange. The technical execution of the film's lighting further underscores the Jungian confrontation between the protagonist and his shadow. Within the Emperor's sanctum, the use of extreme chiaroscuro, sharp, deep pools of shadow against the unnatural, cold luminescence of the Death Star's core serves to externalize the internal battle for Luke's soul. Light is not merely an atmospheric choice here, it is an active participant in the narrative, exposing the scars of Vader's armor while hiding the decaying, predatory features of the Emperor. The integration of these lighting effects with the sophisticated matte paintings and physical set pieces demonstrates a mastery of the practical medium. By refusing to rely on nascent digital alternatives, the production ensures that the physical weight of the actors, the debris of the battlefield, and the sparks of the lightsabers feel tactile and grounded, cementing the reality of the stakes. The choreography of the frame during the film's final act relies on long, fluid movements that replace the rapid-fire editing typical of modern action, allowing the viewer to witness the emotional collapse of the hero. As Luke finally discards his weapon, the camera movement slows and stabilizes, lingering on his face as he sheds his performative identity as a Jedi warrior and accepts his role as a son. This visual stillness communicates his transition from an instrument of external systems, the rebellion or the Jedi Order, into a sovereign individual. The absence of jarring cuts during this pivotal moment creates a profound sense of catharsis, proving that the technical craft is designed specifically to capture the vulnerability of the character's ego. Furthermore, the film's sound design serves as a foundational layer of this psychological landscape. The iconic, rhythmic breathing of Darth Vader, processed to occupy the deepest registers of the sonic mix, creates an environment where the antagonist's presence is felt even when he is physically distant. By layering this organic, labored sound over the synthetic hum of the Death Star's technological systems, the filmmakers create an auditory metaphor for the tension between the natural human spirit and the crushing weight of institutional, imperial power. The silence of the void is employed with equal precision during the transition from the frantic chaos of the space battle to the hushed, intimate dialogue of the throne room. The film drops out ambient noise to force the audience to focus entirely on the moral calculus of the characters. Ultimately, the technical triumph of Return of the Jedi lies in how these diverse craft elements converge to validate the thesis of the film. The technical mastery, from the intricate motion control photography of the fleet battle to the subtle manipulation of light and shadow, is not an end in itself but a vehicle for exploring the limits of power and the necessity of individual choice. The most impressive visual feats in the film are inherently linked to its most significant philosophical revelations, such as the moment of Vader's unmasking. Here, the practical prosthetic makeup, illuminated by the harsh, clinical light of the station, reveals the fragile, aging man underneath the terrifying icon. This final shot acts as a bridge between the cold, technological nightmare of the Empire and the warm, human reality of redemption, proving that the film's true power stems from its ability to reconcile the synthetic nature of the medium with the raw, emotional truth of its characters. Through this synthesis, the craft creates an enduring legacy, cementing the film as a testament to the belief that even within a universe defined by technological mastery and grand-scale conflict, the most transformative power remains the individual's choice to refuse the cycle of violence. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Return of the Jedi concludes its narrative arc by transforming the cyclical, traumatic inheritance of the Skywalker lineage into a quiet, definitive act of individual agency. The final image of the film, which features the shimmering, youthful spirit of Anakin Skywalker alongside the aged mentors of the Jedi Order, serves as a profound recursive loop. It mirrors the film's opening, which emphasizes the cold, industrial architecture of the Death Star, a symbol of systemic, faceless control, by shifting the visual focus toward the liberation of the human soul from the mechanical structures of the Empire. While the galaxy undergoes a political transition, the true resolution is internal. The film posits that the collapse of the state is secondary to the reclamation of the self from the deterministic patterns of the past. The film operates as a cultural mirror for the early 1980s, reflecting a profound anxiety regarding the stability of power and the legacy of institutional conflict. By focusing on the conversion of the antagonist through familial intimacy rather than tactical attrition, Return of the Jedi challenges the era's reliance on binary, militaristic resolutions. It argues that systemic change is inextricably linked to the restoration of personal morality, positioning the protagonist not as a revolutionary soldier, but as a reconciler of fractured identities. This philosophical innovation, the elevation of empathy as the ultimate weapon, fundamentally altered the landscape of blockbuster cinema, moving the genre away from simple triumphalism toward a more complex interrogation of what it means to inherit a history of violence. The unresolved conflict regarding the institutional future of the Jedi Order remains one of the film's most potent features. By leaving the rebuilding of the Order to the vagaries of the future, the film grants the protagonist a genuine, unburdened existence, free from the weight of dogmatic prophecy. Had the film ended with the destruction of the second Death Star, the narrative would be merely a record of external collapse. Instead, by concluding with the funeral pyre and the subsequent celebration, it emphasizes the personal catharsis of Luke Skywalker. The transition from the oppressive, cramped corridors of the Imperial Station to the sprawling, organic greenery of the forest moon of Endor signifies a return to the natural state of human existence, away from the synthetic, high-tech environments that define the Empire's reach. Technically, the film serves as a landmark for the seamless integration of practical artistry and optical innovation. The technical risks taken by the production team, most notably in the complex creature designs of the Jabba's palace sequence and the fluid, expansive cinematography of the climactic space engagement, established a standard for immersive world building. These choices ensure that the environment feels tactile, lived in, and physically heavy, grounding the metaphysical stakes of the Force in a tangible, decaying reality. Future filmmakers look to this synthesis as the gold standard for how technical craft provides the necessary texture to make abstract philosophical concepts feel urgent and earned. The final metaphor of the film is the unmasking of Vader. This moment captures the entire thesis, the shedding of the synthetic, armor-clad exterior to reveal the fragile, dying man beneath. It is a visual representation of the surrender of the ego to the truth of one's own mortality. This act demands that the viewer reconsider the nature of power, suggesting that true authority lies in the courage to discard the machinery of one's own defense. The film ends not with a return to the status quo, but with the genuine, hard-won silence of peace. It offers the audience a resolution built on the understanding that the most profound victories are those won in the quiet spaces of the human heart, effectively ending the cycle of pain by refusing to propagate it further. The legacy of the film is found in this rejection of the system's logic. It remains a poignant testament to the belief that the individual is the final arbiter of their own fate.